One of the ironies about being a vice chancellor is that the one thing I don't control is my diary. Not at all.
A new episode of our science podcast and a new guest. This time is Dave Petley from University of Hull. So thanks, Dave, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you.
And first question is essentially, who are you? What do you do at the moment? And then we usually go back in time.
Great. So I sort of have two roles, really. I mean, my day job is I'm the vice chancellor of the University of Hull. Vice chancellor is sort of combination of being the chief executive and also the most senior academic or the most senior professor in the university. But of course, I'm also an academic by background, and my interest really is in landslides and natural hazards, and I continue to do some research and sort of outreach and activity in terms of advice in that academic area as well.
Thanks. And considering this dual role, I mean, one question is definitely how tricky, how difficult, challenging is to combine them. And of course, the other is, which one do you prefer, if there is a preference?
It's the perfect combination, I think, is the diplomatic answer to that question. I mean, I enjoy them both. Look, my substantive role is to be vice chancellor. But as I said, I am the most senior academic in the university, and it's really important for me to maintain my academic credibility and also expertise. And I'm fascinated by and really love working on landslides and other natural hazards. So I try really hard to make sure that I fulfill all the things I have to do around being the head of the institution. But I also maintain quite a strong interest in both landslide research, and as people may be aware, I write a blog about landslide hazards. I tend to spend most of my daytime working on the university stuff, but I start work very early in the morning, and also spend some time in the evenings and weekends working on the landslide material too. So it's a really kind of fascinating combination. I enjoy it hugely.
We will come to the Landslide blog later. But about the vice chancellor position, it's more, and that's my ignorance, so I might say something wrong. It's more about sort of representing the institution within the UK, internationally. What type of role is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination, really. I mean, one element is that under the UK system, and universities are regulated in the UK, that there has to be a senior responsible officer who ultimately is responsible for everything, and that is me. So I am responsible for the university strategy, ensuring that we're delivering against the expectations. I answer to the trustees, the University Council, and ultimately I'm responsible also for things like ethics and the financial well-being of the institution, and all those things. But then the other half of the role is about representing the institution and promoting it externally, and ensuring that we're connected with the right stakeholders, whether that's in government or students or schools or colleges or whatever. So it does have this kind of interesting inward-facing and outward-facing role at the same time.
Linking to some of the previous interview we had, which essentially some of the guests highlighted how it's becoming challenging academia, especially in the earth science, given the lower number of students. Mm-hmm. Do you see this as one of the main challenges for the University of Hull, in general, UK university? Or
yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's certainly a transformation going on in higher education at the moment, and one element of that is that the attractiveness of UK universities to international students has changed a little bit, and that's really been driven primarily by policies from the previous government. So, I mean, I think all universities have seen a reduction in the number of international students travelling to study with us, and that undoubtedly is a significant challenge. I mean, there are also some other changes occurring. So the number of school leavers going to university is holding up, in fact, increasing slightly, which is good, because we know very well that for students, if they learn more, they earn more ultimately, and that's a good place to be. But for mature students, I think the cost of living crisis has had a really significant impact. So in fact, the number of mature students going on to study at universities is also falling at the moment, which is quite regrettable.
And do you see this number keep going down in the short future, or something unpredictable?
It's hard to know, but the new government, the Labour government that came in July, speaks much more positively. Actually, has a much more positive view of universities, and is promoting us internationally. So I think there are signs now that the international student numbers are starting to recover. So hopefully the situation we're in at the moment is a kind of short-term challenge, not a long-term trend. I'm confident that things will improve, and I do think that UK universities, and of course in particular my institution, the University of Hull, offer a really great experience to students, both our home students and our international students. I spend a lot of time talking to both groups of students, as you'd imagine, and they are overwhelmingly positive about their experience, and they go on to do brilliant things. So I do think that we offer a really good proposition to our students, and we will continue to do so in the future.
And okay, fine, that's an interesting argument. This. What about your past? I mean, you were not at Hull. You have always been at Hull. You were, I think, at Durham, or
yeah. I mean, it's kind of interesting to sort of explore the way the sort of twists and turns your career takes along the way, and I think it's really easy to say that it's all kind of pre-planned, but it absolutely wasn't. Not in the slightest. So I left school at 18 and went to study aeronautical engineering, not geography or the earth sciences. And I did a year of aeronautical engineering at Manchester. Then decided that wasn't the right direction for me, so I moved to King's College in London and studied physical geography there. And I was incredibly lucky to be taught by some absolutely brilliant academics. For example, a very renowned academic called Dennis Brunsden, who was a professor of geomorphology at King's College London, who sadly died earlier this year, in fact, but was absolutely inspirational in terms of his kind of understanding of landscapes and the way that they operate. And field trips with him were just a fantastic experience. But he also worked extensively on landslides, and so you can see how I kind of got into that vibe. So I then went on to do a PhD at UCL, but in fact my PhD was in rock mechanics, was not in natural hazards at all. So I worked on the deformation of mud rocks above oil reservoirs, primarily in the North Sea. And essentially how does strain at the top of the chalk reservoir transmits to the sea floor in the North Sea was really what I was interested in. But it's incredibly difficult to get hold of North Sea mud rocks. Drilling is very, very expensive, and the drilling process sort of breaks them up. So I was looking for a good analog to the right materials, and that took me in the summer of the first year of my PhD to Taiwan. When I was in Taiwan collecting these samples, a tropical cyclone, a typhoon, formed. And so we went and waited out the typhoon in the mountains of Taiwan. And during the extraordinarily heavy rainfall, lots of landslides were triggered whilst we were in the mountains. So when I finished my PhD and I moved to my first lectureship, which was at the University of Sunderland, I was kind of intrigued by this problem, and I didn't have any equipment to do rock mechanics. So I got some money, actually a small amount of money from the British Council, and went back to Taiwan to look at this particular problem. And that is what I've worked on ever since. And so, it's just this kind of weird set of kind of serendipity that leads you to end up studying the thing that you end up studying.
So the oil and gas, I mean, was never, let's say, a real inspiration. You were never attracted, let's say, from that environment, North Sea, where, I don't know, was like, you didn't like the idea of spending time out on a oil rig, or don't know.
No, it's a really good question, and working on rock deformation is really interesting. And I've brought the stuff that I learned from my PhD around kind of experimental work and into my work on landslides quite extensively. But I suppose at heart, I did want to be a field-based scientist. I do really enjoy, and I'm deeply fascinated by the way that landscapes operate and the role that landslides play within them as a sort of landscape system. And I think over the course of the last 30 years, we've learned a lot actually about. I think our view of the way that landslides play a role in the landscape has changed completely. And so I suppose the problem with working on North Sea or oil field stuff is that everything happens out of sight. Whereas the great thing about working on natural hazards is that everything works in sight, and ultimately it was that I found most inspiring.
And was it challenging? Because of course we are in a moment probably where you become so specialized after your PhD in rock mechanics, and then all of a sudden you end up working on natural hazard. Was challenging? Do you think it would be even more and more difficult nowadays than years in the past? Or
yeah, I do think it's more difficult now,
okay.
and partly because I think this is a really interesting aspect. Really high quality research nearly always now depends upon on really quite specialist a field collection or monitoring or such like, and to really be on the cutting edge of research, you actually have to have really advanced techniques in remote sensing or in field instrumentation or whatever. And actually, for most people, the development of those skills comes out of their PhD. Whereas, I did have used my kind of rock mechanics skills, the soil mechanics skills, quite a lot in my career. But it was easy enough to go and do kind of field-based stuff at that time, and without kind of making a fool of yourself, I think. And then I suppose over time what I've done is to collaborate with and then recruit PhD students who have had those specialist skills in remote sensing or whatever, that have allowed us to then kind of put that together as an ensemble.
Okay. And did you, because you say you get, after your PhD, you get this grant from the British Council, did you stay for a little longer in London, or you just moved to Durham after that, or I don't know?
No, it's a bit more complicated actually. So when I finished my PhD, my first job was a lectureship at the University of Sunderland. So up in the northeast of England, and at that point, what used to be polytechnics had just been turned into universities. That happened in 1992, and I got my first job in 1993. And a lot of the former polytechnics, including Sunderland, that had gone through this transition, really saw that as an opportunity to start doing a lot of research. So they at that time there was just a whole host of jobs available for people who were willing to go to those sorts of universities to try to drive their research. So I went there for a couple of years, and then I was asked to go to University of Portsmouth. So I moved to Portsmouth, and I was So I went London to the northeast, and then down to the very south coast, and I spent 5 years at Portsmouth. And Portsmouth was a brilliant place to be, because it had a really strong geology department, and that's where I was, and it also had a fantastic reputation in engineering geology, and that was sort of the space that I was operating in at this point. So Portsmouth gave me the opportunity to really develop my kind of field-based natural hazards work, and collaborate on some European projects and get involved in research. There was kind of really interesting because in Portsmouth you have landslides on the back door, really, because you've got the Isle of Wight, and the landslides on the southern coast of the Isle of Wight just there, and then Dorset is along the coast as well. So it was a really, really good place, both kind of academically and intellectually, but also in terms of access to sites that were of great interest. And then in 2000, I was lucky enough to get a lectureship at the University of Durham. So, I then moved the full length of the country again. But Durham is a fantastic university. I mean, really, really terrific. And that is really where I built my academic career. I was in the Department of Geography at Durham, which is a mighty beast of an academic department, and I just really thrived in that environment.
Okay, so Durham probably was the best in terms of for your academic, let's say, career, best, let's say, moment or best place at that time.
Yeah, Durham is the second best university after Hull, obviously.
Okay, of course, yeah. And was that because, of course, now you have more also this I would probably not say non-academic or more, let's say, representative. I don't know how to say this, Mr. Chancellor, but is that something that you start? I mean, it's something you have already in your mind, or is again another, not random, but a chance you got?
Yeah, it is, again, it's really interesting to reflect what happened. So, I mean, clearly when I went to Durham, I was a lecturer, and I needed to build my research career as well as, be a really good teacher. Because those two aspects of the role are really important. And we were having some success at that time in terms of, winning research grants and being able to take on projects to look at research in landslides in all sorts of places in the world. So we're still working in Taiwan, but also started to do a significant amount of work in the Himalayas at that point, and such like. In particular, I collaborated with a guy in industry at that time, worked for Scott Wilson, the engineering consultant, called Gareth Hearn on essentially landslides in Nepal, and in particular those around associated with, in Nepal at that time, and still now actually, there was a big emphasis on they're called rural access, which is essentially building roads to rural communities. And the idea of those roads is that, if you give people access, then they can get healthcare, and they can access markets, so they can sell products. They can get jobs, so in terms of the development of rural villages, giving rural access, just low-cost roads is a really important element. But what was really very, very clear was that a lot of those roads were being built in areas that were extremely landslide prone, and of course the monsoon is a big issue in South Asia. And there were a significant number of people being killed and injured on these low-cost roads. And also there was a lot of damage occurring, so very often they'd be blocked in the monsoon and severely damaged. So the project was really trying to understand how we could build low-cost roads better to prevent landslides happening on them. So that was really interesting. But working in that environment, one of the things that I realized was that that actually, the worst landslide problems were occur in mountain areas in less developed countries. And of course, as it turns out, the southern edge of the Himalayas is the most affected part of the world, full stop. But actually, in those environments, there was a very poor understanding, actually, of even the kind of landslide hazard, from an academic perspective, let alone from a kind of societal perspective. There was very limited capability to deal with them, or to understand them. And when accidents happened, really there was no capability to respond to them. So it's kind of poor combination. So we set out at Durham to basically offer support to poorer countries with what was initially a sort of landslide centre that was absolutely focused on those three elements. So undertaking research in countries where research was needed, building capacity, whether it's in government or industry or in universities, and being able to support response to disasters when they happen. So we did that for landslides and really successfully, and we got some support from some benefactors to help us with that. And then subsequently, we then turned that into a university-wide institute, the Institute of Hazard Risk and Resilience, that grew out of the Landslide Centre as a kind of initial seed. And Durham is now a very successful entity that has many people working for it and runs a master's program and lots of PhD students. And it's been really, really successful. We built a building. But it was taking that initial idea of kind of a little kind of research centre and building it into this institute. That was my kind of first experience of leadership, and I'm an introvert. Leadership is not something that was an obvious career direction for me at all. Sometimes you see people and you can just see that they're born leaders. That it certainly wasn't apparent to me that wasn't an obvious direction for me. But I found that I really, really enjoyed it. And so, from that initial kind of first taste of doing something around research, it was just a sort of, wow, actually leadership is kind of interesting and fun and very challenging, but incredibly rewarding. Yeah.
And you mentioned you started this research group also with benefactor. Do you mean someone like private citizen or okay?
Yeah, exactly that. So very, very kind people who've made money elsewhere who were willing to support the research because or the work that we were doing, because they saw the benefit that it would
the societal benefit.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you say leadership was, let's say, was not in your mind at that time, at the beginning, and you then realize that you enjoyed what's the most challenging bit. Based on your experience.
Yeah, I think if you ask that question to any leader, they will tell you that the most challenging bit is people, really, because people are very, very complicated, and you know what, as a leader, really you're there to, you should be there to provide that kind of strategic insight, sense of vision and purpose and where you're trying to go. And you should work with people around you to set that, but ultimately it is your role to define what the strategic purpose of your organization is. But at that point, it is all about actually ensuring that you bring out the best of the people that work for you. You basically construct the best team, and then you create an environment in which those people are able to flourish, in the strategic direction that you want the organization to go. And really is I always think that probably the point about leadership for me is in a university. Ultimately, there are lots and lots of people who can do better research than I can. And my key role should be to ensure that they have the opportunities to be the best that they can be. And if I can do that as a leader, whatever level I've been in my career, if I can do that, then the benefit to society is far greater than if I were to just focus on my own research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's the time Durham was also the time where you start the Landslide blog, or was something that came after?
That was at Durham. Yeah, I was in 2007. Yeah.
Okay, so the Landslide blog, just for the viewer, it's probably for a lot of people, especially academics, it could be probably the main source of information or the primary source of information about landslide all over the world. And I think it's hosted by EOS now.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so if you Google EOS Landslide blog, would be probably the first result from the Google search. And So did you start? I mean, I have a personal question. Do you still do the blog by yourself? So do you write?
I do. It's entirely done by me. Yeah, that's right.
Wow. Wow. Because I mean, I always, I thought, okay, you as a so busy with also the vice chancellor position, and you find time to, okay. So that's passion, I think, is best. Even if it's night, morning, you still like, you are there.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I do it partly because I really enjoy it. uh, so it is in some ways it's a little bit, it's kind of a bit selfish. I think. I mean, basically, I start work very early in the morning,
Okay.
and so I usually write it
Mm.
before 7 a.m. Each piece that I write, and I tend to write about something that I just think is really interesting from my perspective.
Okay.
So something that's kind of piqued my interest along the way. Um, and one of the reasons that I do it is that one of the reasons I write it very early in the morning is that as a vice chancellor, it's actually very easy to become detached from your academic discipline. And I think it's a really healthy thing to do 2 or 3 times a week at the start of each day, to actually sit down and try to do something that is academic, that kind of links you back to what you intended to be as an academic, as a kind of mental framing of your day. I think it's a really good thing to do. So I think there is something there for me about just maintaining that sense of of passion about my regional academic discipline, and not becoming just purely if you like, a manager. But I mean, if the kind of history of it is that back in the early 2000s, I mean, blogs were very new at that stage, but there was a very passionate debate going on around climate change then, and there was an awful lot of disinformation. I mean, much more so than there is now, being sown, and so there was a series of climate scientists that set up blogs, and essentially it was a way of trying to make themselves heard, to provide a kind of honest narrative about the research they were doing and their understanding of climate change, as a way of kind of buffering against some of this extremely well-funded disinformation that was being put out. And I was kind of following some of those blogs and really, really interested in it, and what those people were doing, and I had a huge admiration actually for them, because in a lot of cases they were kind of battling against really significant headwinds, but they knew that scientifically that it was the right thing. So as I was reading these blogs, I was just thinking, actually, it would be kind of really interesting to see whether there was any interest in something in Landslide. So at that stage there was a very simple blog tool called Blogger, and so I just set up a site, and started writing just to see what would happen, really, and it grew from that.
Okay. Yeah. And how important is a lot of people, some of the interviewee, they say that nowadays social play a huge role in communication. Probably, I mean, personally, I think sometimes could be more impactful blogs rather than a science paper. It can reach more people, but that's of course my vision. Do you agree, or what do you think? I mean,
I do. I mean, we mustn't move away from the peer-reviewed scientific literature. It is incredibly important, and that sort of quality check that comes from that is really key. And so I'm not in any way kind of disparaging that element. There are probably things that we need to change around the way that we publish at the moment. I think I don't think it's a very sustainable model. But nonetheless, I do think that kind of the core of the peer-reviewed scientific journal is kind of fundamental to what we're trying to achieve as scientists. But I think we also need to recognise the fact that that writing scientific papers is a very exclusive activity. I mean, the majority of people will never read a scientific paper, and frankly, nor would they ever want to. And so there is a really important role of saying, no, these are the things that we're discovering, and these are how they then resonate in wider society. I mean, the thing I really like about my blog, which is what very nearly 17 years old now, so it'll be 17 years next month, and and it's moved around a little bit in terms of its home, but now it's on the AGU, American Geophysical Union EOS site. That's a really kind of good location for it. But the thing I really like about it is it is accessed quite a lot by the academic community, obviously, but it's also read by the practitioner community a lot. In particular, people who are working on landslide hazards and want to understand how other people are dealing with them or what's going on elsewhere. It's used quite a lot by school teachers and educators, which so you're kind of reaching out to people who are are teaching kind of the next generation, and that's good. And I quite often get emails from from school children who are doing a landslide project. And then it's also accessed by members of the general public, in particular when there's a particular kind of landslide event going on. And I sometimes I provide support or help into members of the public who are facing a significant landslide challenge in one way or another. So I like the way that it kind of has these multiple audiences, and as a scientist who is deeply passionate about this subject, I can kind of reach out to different groups. I suppose the only other thing that I would say is that what I write on the blog is only ever a first take.
Yeah.
It can only ever be a kind of first interpretation. That doesn't mean that it's right. And in particular, when there are these significant landslides, it's always essential that the scientific community then examines those events and does the proper analysis that the blog is never going to be.
And how much remote sensing has, let's say, impacted your work as academic and also the blog? Did they allow, because a lot of the things I see on the blog is, of course, satellite data. So how these, do you think is almost like, from your perspective, fundamental, has been critical for the growing of the blog, but also of your career? What do you think?
It's a great question, and and in a way, there's almost so much to talk about here that it's difficult to know where to start. But I mean, at the point where I started my academic career, or in particular when I started to work on landslides, I mean, there was satellite data available, but it was the early versions of Landsat with very, very coarse resolution, which for most landslides wasn't really very helpful at all. And those kind of early optical instruments, although they were fascinating and really, really interesting, they weren't particularly great. There was a lot of people using aerial photography, but in an incredibly manual way. I mean, it really was stereo pairs and a stereoscope and mapping out landslides and such. And brilliant work was done, but my goodness, extraordinarily kind of complex, both in terms of collecting good sets of data, but also in interpreting it. And then in terms of kind of more usable systems, I mean, there were people who were trying to do things like take very, very early digital cameras and hang them from kites and that sort of thing. I mean, digital cameras were just sort of becoming available. Yeah. I mean, when I did, probably for the first 10 years of my career, I mean, all the photographs we took were slides. They weren't digital. So really, it was incredibly rudimentary. But then, during the period that I was at Durham, there was just this extraordinary explosion in capability that has occurred ever since. So if I pick up one example, but we might want to talk about others, one of the things that we became very interested in Durham was basically rockfall processes on coastal cliffs. South of Durham on the North Yorkshire coast, there are big high cliffs. that are actively eroding, and they erode because essentially the toe of the landslide, the toe of the cliff gets eroded, and then you get rock falls occurring. And we were really interested in this. But the question is, how can you actually understand what's going on a coastal cliff, which twice a day has the North Sea at its toe. It has a big wave cut platform, but twice a day has the North Sea at its toe. Incredibly difficult to get access to it. But this was just the point where two technologies were becoming available, that were remote sensing technologies becoming available, that were just fabulous. The first was photogrammetry. So we started off doing some work where we would go back to the field sites, in particular on the monthly very, very low tide, and take stereo pairs of photographs of the cliffs, and then build a three-dimensional digital elevation model of the cliff, and then look at change. And this kind of combination of the availability of digital photogrammetry and being able to kind of rapidly auto-rectify it, and then look at change models through software was kind of really exciting. But then very, very soon after that, because that at that time that was a very manual process, and there are distortion problems with the fact that you're at the foot of the cliff. The new terrestrial LiDAR instruments became available, and I remember, I don't know, it was about 2005, I think, a commercial company coming to us and saying, we got this instrument, and it was 250 points per second laser scanner, and we took them out into our field sites and said, okay, so scan that for us. So they did the scan. And of course the salesman was, and we can do all these things, and although, and I must admit I was all a bit kind of cynical about it. So we went to a local coffee shop, and he got out his very early laptop, and I said to him, so show me the data. So he pulled up the point cloud, and then he put a surface on it, and then he'd taken a photograph, and he draped the photograph onto it, and it was just like it was an absolute eureka moment. It was just this, oh my God, you can do that. It was extraordinary. It was a quantum leap in capability that was just amazing. And so we bought one of these instruments, and then we took to doing scans on a monthly basis. But what that allowed us to then do was to look at change from one month to the next, and then and so you could start to map on the rock face where the rock falls were happening. It started to allow us to do things like so a big collapse would occur, and then you could go back through the archive and look at how that evolved over time. It allowed us to look at the kind of size of blocks, the shape of blocks that were coming off, how the detachment related to weather, because we put a weather station on the top of the cliff. So was it more stormy? Were the waves bigger? It was just such a step forward in technology and capability, and it was just amazing. And that was transformative in terms of our understanding then of how those cliffs were working.
And you were at Durham. You were starting to have this blog, now also terrestrial laser scan. Then what went wrong? I mean, why you decided to change then to Hull, which I think is the last. After Durham, you went to Hull. There was no intermediate. No. Okay. Did you went down to the south again?
So there's So there's two universities in between.
Okay.
Believe it or not. So essentially, I was. I led the development of the Research Institute, Institute of Hazard Risk and Resilience, and was doing that alongside my research. So doing a lot of work in New Zealand on landslides, doing stuff in the Himalayas and in northern Pakistan. Just great stuff. But I was slowly also being drawn into increasingly kind of senior leadership roles within Durham. So I was a professor, but I was also the deputy to the Pro-Vice Chancellor, the strategic lead for research in the institution, and actually just really enjoying that leadership work, and in particular loving working with researchers across the university. So, as well as doing my own stuff, one day I'd be working with a group who were really interested in primary age school testing and what that tells you about children's development. But the next day I'd be working with someone who was actually working on post-traumatic stress disorder in American military officers, and how you could use the classical tales, the Greek classical and Roman classical tales, to get these people to understand their post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, just this kind of fascinating range of the brilliant things that are done by academics in universities, and just really, really enjoying kind of working with and facilitating the research of all these different people. And so in 2014, I moved to the University of East Anglia, UEA, to take on that strategic research leadership role there. And I did that for 2 years, and then I was asked to go to the University of Sheffield to take on the same role. And in a couple of different guises, I did that for 6 years at Sheffield, as well as sort of maintaining my own research, before then moving to Hull.
Wow, it was a long journey.
Yeah, guys. I mean,
You're England.
I think Hull is the ninth university I've either studied at or worked at. So I've been around the block a bit.
Wow. And can you, I don't know, I mean, how we probably touched this at the beginning, but I don't know how your day-to-day work. Do you have, do you prefer to have like a day just on the research side, another day on the vice counseling stuff, or you mix? I mean, you cannot actually divide the two.
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of one of the ironies about being a vice chancellor is the one thing I don't control is my diary. That's all. I mean, partly because there's a whole set of fixed things that I just have to do. So so every Tuesday morning, for example, for 3 hours, there's a leadership team meeting that I must chair. There's things like the University Senate that I chair, and the University Council meeting that I must attend, and then lots and lots of subcommittees. And so, those things appear in my diary, and I must go and do. So every day has these kind of things that are in it that I need to do. But then around that, there's just such a high volume of other activity that comes in that essentially I delegate responsibility for my diary to my absolutely brilliant PA. And essentially, each evening she will print out for me the list, my diary sheet for what I'm going to do the next day, and that's what I then do. So the about being a vice chancellor is the one thing you don't control is your own time.
You just have to obey and say, okay, I will be there. And do you think in the role you are now, do you think it was worth it? I mean, all the journey, all the experience, they were all needed to bring you where you are now? Or, I mean, for example, some of the stuff you do now are, I would say, not totally unrelated, but your previous academic background doesn't really help it, or I don't know. I mean, let's say the research side of things is totally different from this more managerial role you have.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of get that point. I don't think I see it like that, actually.
Okay.
The way I view it is that so everything that I do, including the things that don't go well, and there's lots of those, is opportunities to learn, I do spend quite a lot of time kind of reflecting on on experiences and things that have gone well and things that have not gone well, and then just try to continually learn from those things. And all of those experiences then feed into the other things that I do. So I think my leadership career has actually made me a better researcher.
Okay.
But I think my research career and the teaching that I've done has made me a better leader. And and at times in the landslide work, it's been necessary to deal with some really difficult situations. I remember people who've been reading my blog for a long time will sort of remember this. There was a big landslide in 2010 in northern Pakistan, called Atabad, which blocked a valley up in the high mountains. And I worked very extensively with and documented all of this on the blog, but worked very extensively with an NGO called Focus Humanitarian Assistance, one of the Aga Khan's charities, where we were basically trying to manage the hazard, and in particular manage the risk to the communities who were downstream of this landslide. And it was very fraught and very difficult and very, very intense at that time. But having to sort of deal with this kind of crisis on the fly, and communicate with different stakeholders, including the Pakistan government, the Pakistan army, the NGO community, obviously the kind of development aid community, other people who were really interested in this hazard, was probably the most stressful thing that I've ever done in my life. I mean, it was really, really tough. But the learning from that of how to deal with such a pressured environment has been fantastic to then take into my leadership career, because there are difficult things that go on here, but sometimes I just think, well, but on this occasion we don't have 14,000 people living downstream of a landslide that might rupture.
Yeah, it's the pressure.
Yeah.
Everything else looks quite easy.
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
Solvable. I think I have one of my last questions is how do you switch off from work during weekend or annual leave?
I do. So I sort of wear my heart on my sleeve on this. I'm a absolutely addicted Coventry City Football Club supporter.
Coventry.
Coventry.
Are you originally from Coventry?
Yeah, okay. Exactly. Just outside Coventry, and I've supported them for all of my life. And so I have a 22-year-old son, Adam, and both of us are season ticket holders for Coventry. But we also go to pretty much every away game as well. So we go home and away. And my son Adam is a student at University of Liverpool. So every Saturday and some evenings during the week we meet up at a game. So last Saturday I was in Middlesbrough. Next Saturday I'll be in Sunderland. So
at least you can control the weekends.
That's right. So I very deliberately go and do something completely different, and absolutely love it. It's terrific. It's great. And then in terms of holidays, yes, I really like to travel, and I tend to travel with either Adam or my daughter Holly. So for example, she and I spent 2.5 weeks in Chile in August and September, and we just flew to Chile, hired a car, and then set off and went right up into the Atacama. It was fabulous, and she's studying geography at Manchester, so we had a whale of a time. Also,
the boy is following the natural hazard career, or
no, he's developing a career in international business. So he's doing something completely different, but he loves that, so that's good.
That's the most important things.
Yeah.
Dave, that was my last question. So thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure.